tragic events of 9/11 have painted a negative picture of Islam in the minds and hearts of a lot of Americans. Some people even think that there is a historical conflict between Islam and the West. So can you tell us about the history of interaction between Muslims and the rest of the faith groups throughout the history of Islam?
Yeah, it's a kind of double-edged sword, if I can use that particular expression, because beyond a shadow of a doubt, Islam would have us speak the truth. And speaking the truth, there has been a historical conflict with Islam and other groups of people, non-Muslims, particularly the Christians. We cannot gloss over the history of the Crusades and look at what happened during the Crusades, which in the name of religion, many Muslims believe that the Crusades were instituted as the first imperialistic element for the nations of Europe. It was global imperialism when Europe came into the lands primarily of the Muslims doing what they were doing, but they did it in the name of religion. And there has been historically a history in which conflict has existed between the non-Muslim land and the lands of the Muslims. But this conflict is nothing that's generic or inherent to the faiths themselves. There are bad people and have been bad people amongst the Christians and Jews and Muslims historically. And many of the gross excesses in relationships with human beings, with Muslims and non-Muslims, has been brought about by these excesses. It has nothing to do with the religions of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. And so when we turn to periods in the history in which there have been more enlightened periods, we can turn to the history of Spain. And you have in Spain a history where Muslims, starting in 711 of the Common Era, were the governing factor and most influential force on the Iberian Peninsula for almost 800 years. And during this 800 years, you find that there were cooperative relationships. As a matter of fact, if I could just go back just 1 second before talking about what happened in Spain, the Muslims of North Africa were invited into Spain by Roman Catholics and by the Jews because of the persecution that the Roman Catholics and the Jews were experiencing at the hands of a Christian group who were primarily identified as Visigoths. And these Visigoths were people who believed that Jesus, peace be upon him, was not the Son of God. And of course, Spain at that time was a predominantly Roman Catholic nation. And when the Visigoths took over in Spain, they persecuted those Roman Catholics and they persecuted the Jews of the land. So the Catholics and the Jews in Spain wrote to the North African governor of the Umayyad Caliphate, Musa ibn Nasir, and asked that the Muslims come to Spain and assist them in throwing off the shackles of this very oppressive regime that they were experiencing. And so in 711 of the Common Era, we find that Musa sent a Muslim by the name of Tariq ibn Ziyad into Spain, and which started a sequence of Muslim influence and domination for perhaps the next 800 years. So during this period of time, even the Jewish scholars write that this was a time of tremendous cooperation and enlightenment for not only the Muslims but also the Jewish community because of the way that the Muslims treated the Jews and the Christians under their rule and under their authority. We can look in various pages of history of Muslim relations. We can find that throughout the Muslim world, which many people find very curious. I found myself curious when I traveled a few years ago to the Muslim country of Iran. In Iran, I was amazed that there were so many Jews, Jewish people, living in the country of Iran. And when you travel around the Muslim Middle East, when you travel to Turkey and other predominantly Muslim countries, you'll find a very similar phenomena. And this phenomena started because of the persecution that many of the Jews were experiencing in Europe. And as a result, they were welcomed and brought into the Muslim lands as a safeguard for themselves, as a faith community and a people of Ahl Kitab, a people of the book. And they have lived oftentimes and most times in these Muslim countries, predominantly and sometimes almost 100% Muslim countries. They have lived in peace for decades because the Muslim leadership invited them in and allowed them. We can find even during the Crusades some of the most gracious behavior on the battlefield as well as in the aftermath of battle. You can find on the part of Muslims like Salahuddin Ayyubi in 1187, who recaptured Jerusalem in the name of Islam. And when you see how Salahuddin Ayyubi allowed the Jewish population to come back in, and for hundreds of years they were still back in Jerusalem, we can see that there are instances both in more history at a distance and more modern history in which these faiths have not only coexisted but have had very peaceful relationships. So there's nothing inherent about any of these faiths that would bring about an ongoing conflict.